Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webcast, Trump or Biden? What will it mean for Brazil and Bolsonaro? Before we start, I invite those watching this webcast to submit any questions for our panelists, either by email at brazil@wilsoncenter.org or by Twitter to @BrazilINST. In both cases, it's Brazil with a Z. We are including that contact information as well on the webpage for the event. So I look forward to the questions. So on to the show. With the US elections fast approaching, governments around the world are considering the implications of either of the re-election of President Trump or the election of Joe Biden in terms of their relationship with the United States. There are few international leaders who are as closely associated with President Trump in terms of their approach and overall worldview as Brazilian President Bolsonaro. Both are seen as political outsiders in conflict with their respective establishments. Both are comfortable breaking political traditions. Both have fervent supporters and fervent opponents at home and share a skepticism of the multilateral system. The close identification between the two leaders has been accompanied by a very active bilateral relationship in recent years as well, building on longer standing efforts to bring the United States and Brazil closer together. In recent years, the United States and Brazil have increased cooperation on Venezuela, on security matters, on commercial relations, and President Trump designated Brazil a major non-NATO ally in 2019, and also indicated support for Brazilian accession to the OECD, and finalized an agreement as well to allow for US space launches from Brazil, among other advances in the relationship. Many observers assume that President Bolsonaro might not enjoy the same rapport with a more conventional political leader in the United States, including Vice President Biden. Bolsonaro's expression of support for Trump's re-election strengthened that assumption, although the Brazilian government was quick to assert that they would work productively with either person, with either candidate. The issue of potential friction between President Bolsonaro's government and a possible Biden administration came back into the public eye last week when Vice President Biden said in his September 29th debate with President Trump that he might consider economic sanctions on Brazil if Brazil declined to take steps to slow deforestation in the Amazon. President Bolsonaro and other Brazilian officials responded vigorously, rejecting assertions that Brazil wasn't doing enough to curb environmental damage in the country. So we're joined by three experts today who are going to help us sort out what all this might mean for relations between the United States and Brazil in the coming years, regardless of who wins in November. So first, Ricardo Mendes. He's a director with Prospectiva Consulting in Sao Paulo, responsible for the firm's international operations. Ricardo is a highly regarded analyst of regional affairs. Patricia Campos Melo is a noted investigative journalist and international correspondent for Folha de Sao Paulo, with many awards to her name, including the International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Patricia is also an author and recently published A Máquina do Ódio, Notas de uma repórter sobre a fake news e a violência digital. Welcome, Patricia. Brian Winter, also a journalist and author, and editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. Brian recently authored in Foreign Affairs one of the best reports I've seen explaining Bolsonaro's resilience to outside observers to help them understand the context of the strength of his political leadership. Before we get started, just a reminder to send any questions to brazil@wilsoncenter.org or to Twitter @BrazilInst. Ricardo, could we start with you to help us set the scene? Brazilian Ambassador Nestor Forster shared two related questions that I think can help us do that. First, are there elements of the US-Brazil relationship that are likely to remain strong and productive regardless of who is elected in November? And second, as noted earlier, there have been some significant advances in bilateral relations over the last few years. Are there elements that you see having a lasting impact in the US-Brazil bilateral relationship? Ricardo, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Before I get started, just wanted to thank Ricardo Zuniga for this invitation. Thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholar, the Brazil Institute. Really a pleasure to be back here. I've been here in a few occasions in the past, and it's really a pleasure to join this kind of discussions with my fellow panelists today. Well, let me start with the less controversial issues, if we can put it this way, because I do think that there is many issues that will remain on the bilateral agenda, regardless of who wins the elections. Brazil and the US, they have a very stable and long-standing relationship. I mean, this has endured many different administrations with different ideologies. Surprisingly, we had heads of state in Brazil who you wouldn't expect to get along well with the president in the United States, such as the case of Lula and Bush. There's no need to say that Cardoso and Clinton also had a very good personal relationship. And there were cases in which the personal relationship wasn't as close as those two examples I just gave, in which relations continued in spite of this closeness of the president. So I do think that the countries share a lot of common interests globally, internationally. They do have core political values that are very similar, if not to say the same. I think these things remain regardless, again, of governments, even during the military governments in Brazil. Some of those values remain in place. So I do think that most of the agenda will remain regardless, again, of who wins the election. Okay? To get started, just to give a few examples, I think one of the most important issues on the bilateral agenda is the business agenda, if we can put it this way. And business, I mean, the US remains the main, the number one investor in Brazil. I mean, if you compare the stock of investments, historically, the US remains by far the main investor in Brazil. And this really drives a lot of demands, a lot of issues that are negotiated bilaterally, and just I think we can call this the improving landscape agenda, which includes tax, includes different kinds of trade facilitation, intellectual property, business travel, tourism. And these are issues that will remain there. I see absolutely no possibility for a change here. I think this is there is a very dense and mature network between the private sectors in the two countries. A significant part of this agenda is driven by multinational companies that are based in Brazil and who keep demanding that these topics are included in the bilateral agenda. So this will definitely continue to be there. As a reflection of this, I think some of the technical dialogues that we have in place will also continue. So discussions between Fed and agendas, between Fed and the Brazilian Central Bank, discussions between regulators, Visa, FDA, discussions in the energy industry. These are kind of issues that are driven by private sector interests, and I believe they will continue to be as important as they are now, regardless of who is in the White House in a few months. More recently, I think the two countries have also strengthened the cooperation in the areas of security. And when I say security, I'm not talking about military, although there was some advances there as well. I'm talking about sharing intel, the police, the federal police in Brazil, working with the FBI. Brazil relying a lot on the US intelligence for investigating international crimes, which Brazil has become an important hub for some of these activities. And I believe this will continue. The countries share a lot of interest here. This will definitely be one important area of cooperation. Also, just to get into newer agendas that were actually started by the Trump government, and which I believe will continue and will actually gain importance in Brazil and could potentially become even more important in the bilateral relations. Uh, just to give an example, the US-led IDB has recently launched in partnership with the Brazilian BNDES a financial cooperation for small and medium enterprises. And I really see, I mean, from what I could read and from what I've been following on Biden's agenda, this will be the kind of approach that he will seek to pursue with the region. So I see a lot more space for these kinds of financial cooperation at a time that Brazil badly needs these resources. Okay, Brazil will be in a bad fiscal situation in the coming up years, and it will need any kind of help that it can get, including for the environment area, which was something mentioned in the debate. But let's get into that later. And just to conclude my initial remarks here, I think there is something else we need to take into account with this, the Chinese presence in Latin America. This will remain a key concern for the United States, regardless of who wins the elections. And there will be changes in the way this is dealt bilaterally, but I don't see any other possibility but for the two countries to continue working together and continue cooperating and perhaps even strengthening the cooperation under this new geopolitical scenario. So I think these are just some of the areas that I think will continue, and we can get into the more controversial areas in a minute.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ricardo. We will circle back to that issue of China. I think that merits a discussion in its own right. Patricia, could we turn to you now to discuss a few areas where President Bolsonaro and the Brazilian government might need to consider shifting their approach in the event of a Biden victory? Do you see any particular points of friction that really jump out to you?
Thank you, Ricardo. It's an honor to be here in a panel moderated by you and with such distinguished colleagues, Ricardo and Brian. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think, yes, we could say that there are a few areas that are going to cause some friction. If we think about it, in March 2019, the first visit that President Bolsonaro to the US. So he went to the White House and he publicly endorsed President Trump's re-election. I remember that day we were in the Rose Garden, it was during the press conference. A few months later, if I'm not mistaken, his son, Representative Eduardo Bolsonaro, was wearing a Trump 2020 hat. And the foreign minister is famous for writing an article for the Diplomacy Journal saying that Trump was the only thing that could save the Western civilization. So in July, Representative Eliot Engel, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he tweeted, please, something along those lines, please stay out of our election after once again, Representative Eduardo Bolsonaro tweeted something in support of Trump's re-election. And I think that might have been, a very important changing point there, because they realized that repeatedly either endorsing President Trump or criticizing progressives or, giving opinions about the US elections was not a good idea. I think up until then, they were not hedging their bets at all, the government. I mean, you could see the work, the really needed and important work of the diplomats and of the more technical authorities. But the politicians and the deputies and President Bolsonaro mainly, they were not hedging their bets. And then, so they started to pivot a little bit, started saying, oh, actually the relationship is with the country, is not only between the presidents, and they stopped endorsing publicly President Trump's re-election because they realized that it was causing the kind of friction that would be very hard to solve if Vice President Joe Biden gets elected. So now they're in this point that they are trying to do some damage control with all the endorsement or cheering for Trump that they had been doing. And I think there's two areas that might be very important in mending the relationship. China and Venezuela. China, because of course, either if we have a Democratic or Republican administration in the US, China is still going to be one of the main issues. Brazil is in the very important point that it has to decide if it's going to allow or not Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company, in its 5G infrastructure. And we have conflicting voices inside the government. You have agricultural ministry and the vice president that are more diplomatic, so to say, and they have not said, we're not gonna ban Huawei. And the foreign ministry and the president himself have been saying, sovereignty and national security are really important issues to consider when we're talking about the auctions, the 5G auctions. So I think this is one of the themes that are very relevant to the bilateral relationship. And I think this is one topic that it's going to have some convergence. And Venezuela, of course, maybe in a Biden government, you wouldn't have such a, not sure how to describe this, but a very aggressive stance in saying, we have to get rid of Nicolás Maduro. It would be a little bit more subtle, and even they would keep the sanctions, but not as aggressive, the rhetoric. But still, it is something that would unite both countries. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of homework for Brazilian government to do regarding, of course, the environment. Right now, inside the Brazilian government, there's a perception that the problem with the environment is not that we're having record numbers of fires and deforestation. No, it's a communications problem. It's a PR problem. So inside all the government, be it SECOM, the communications secretary, or Itamaraty, there's a view that actually, foreign media and domestic that it's not that bad. And so they have really show people that actually our environmental policy is really good, and we don't have, the deforestation was even worse in previous administrations. So, and this is going to have to change because the constituency of Vice President Biden and the Democrats, they're going to be, asking or demanding for some action in this part. And we heard this in the debate. I mean, it was one of the only countries that was mentioned. It was Brazil, Russia, and China, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And Brazil specifically about the Amazon and the destruction of the Amazon. So it's not gonna be effective if they're still in this denial attitude to say, it's just a communications problem. And on the other hand, the other problem that it's also going to demand a lot of homework is human rights and, policy towards minorities in Brazil. This is something that is also very important to Vice President Biden's base, and it needs a lot of homework. They're going to have to change at least the perception. I mean, in international fora, there's been a lot of guidelines from Itamaraty, as in policy, how to talk about, for instance, gender ideology, as they talk about this, or women's health. And this is not very well this is not going to, be accepted by a Biden administration as easily, because right now Brazil is in this. They call it. It's the Alliance for Religious Freedom, I think, and it basically unites the U.S., Hungary, Poland, and Brazil as these countries defending, religious freedom, but it's actually Christianity's freedom. They say, I mean, President Bolsonaro even said that they're fighting against Christophobia. I'm not sure how to translate this in Brazil, but the whole thing about this countries united around, the preservation of the Western Christian civilization and the family. This is going to change. Brazil is going to be isolated, or Brazil is just going to be with Hungary and Poland, and not having the U.S. government as, a support. Brazil is really going to be isolated. So these are areas I think that they're going to demand a lot of homework.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I think we're going to circle back to a number of those as well. Again, you note China comes up again. The issue of Venezuela comes up again, and I think so. We'll spend a little more time on these. I'm sure that we'll probably have questions from the public as well, because these are obviously going to be some core areas in the relationship, alongside these environmental issues that you flagged. Brian, I wonder if we could start with you on the question of Brazil from the U.S. perspective, and how Brazil is seen as a regional player, as a regional actor. I noted in the introduction that you had written a piece that was very well received in the United States, explaining the strengths of Bolsonaro's support, and trying to explain that this was something that couldn't be understood superficially. It required some context. How should all of this fit in the event of really either administration? How is Brazil going to fit, and what's happening in Brazil? How would that interact with U.S. objectives in the region from your perspective?
Well, thank you, Ricardo, for the question. And as Patricia and Ricardo have noted, what an interesting panel to have put together. I'm very honored to be here. Look, certainly there's a lot of enthusiasm in both Washington and Brasilia. What you hear in both capitals is this idea, this feeling that maybe never in the modern history of bilateral ties, has there been a greater desire, at least to get things done, kind of powered by this personal affection, if not friendship, between the two presidents. And look, the private sectors in both countries are enthusiastic about it too. There's no question. That's partly because Brazil's economy has been stagnant or shrinking for so long. Don't forget that Brazil went into this crisis with its GDP at levels of 2010 on a per capita basis. And so anything that can sort of stir the economy from that slumber is being seen with a lot of hope and enthusiasm by the private sectors in both countries right now. Look, we've already covered a lot of ground on this one. I think in Washington and on Wall Street, there's been a feeling sometimes that it's a friendship in search of a policy agenda, that the enthusiasm has sometimes outstripped the deliverables, which has left bureaucrats in both capitals to scramble for trophies that they can kind of hang on the wall as proof. I think that has some truth to it. Maybe it's a bit unfair. I mean, we have seen some progress on some of the issues that Ricardo cited, things like trade facilitation, the Alcantara satellite base, OECD membership. Those are important things. They're all agenda items that have been around for a long time, that date from my time as a reporter based in Brazil from 2010 to 2015. These were items that were on Dilma Rousseff's state visit that never happened. Ricardo, you know this better than any of us. I mean, some of these are agenda items that were put together a long time ago. And it speaks to the fact that US-Brazil relations have almost always been cordial, if not good. The only time in recent memory that I can think when things were really tough was around 2010, when during Lula's final year, when Brazil tried to get involved in the U.S.-Iran issue, and that made a lot of people really angry. But beyond that, things have mostly been good. When the Bolsonaro government, you'll see them say things like, we had decades of governments in Brazil that were anti-American, and this is historic what's happening now. That's politics. It's not true. Certainly, though, The enthusiasm is real. And look, I think that there's a lot of hope in both capitals that if there is a second Trump term, that you'll see this alignment continue. And I've heard talk, which I've frankly found a little bit surprising. I've heard talk that genuine belief that there could be a meaningful trade deal in a second Trump administration. The US Trade Representative Lighthizer at one point seemed to indicate, at least to me, that that was off the table. But I've heard from multiple people.
That's USTR starting position anytime, Brian. Always.
Okay, well, fair enough. You know, what I've heard from multiple people is that that was actually kind of a technical answer to a technical question, and that maybe something like big and meaningful could be, you know, possible over the next couple of years. One thing that seems likely under either Biden or Trump, and Patricia mentioned this, and I think Ricardo did as well, is, you know, this idea of common cause against China. I think that the biggest change in the Democratic Party establishment compared to 4 years ago is the degree to which they now think that China is a rival, if not a threat. That's a big evolution there, and it's one that I understand that a future President Biden would be likely to continue, and that's also one reason why most people expect that at least at the beginning, a Biden government would seek a cordial relationship with Jair Bolsonaro. The other big reason for that being that Biden knows that on January 20th, 2021, provided that we don't have a constitutional crisis here in the United States after the election that results in, you know, some kind of delay, they know that they will face a very complicated world, a world that is still in the midst of a recession that's likely to, or at least an economic stagnant period that's likely to continue for some time. Some of it's also personal. Biden's just not the kind of guy who holds a grudge. Just a few other thoughts on what might happen under a Biden administration. I've seen, Patricia made reference to this. It's been an interesting shift over the last 2 months or so to see some people in the orbit of the government start using language to prepare for the possibility of a Biden government. Even the Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro, who Patricia mentioned, very prominent in the relationship at one point, was cotado, as they say, as a potential ambassador in Washington. Even he, I forget what the exact language was, but kind of trying to distance himself from that famous moment with the Trump hat back in 2018. So they understand that they need to perhaps hedge their bets a bit. Where I think, though, it gets difficult for them is if the Amazon issue in particular crosses over from the realm of the foreign policy experts and into our domestic politics. And I know of no other way to say this than to say, if AOC starts tweeting about Bolsonaro, the relationship will be in trouble. And it's not difficult to imagine that happening. But a lot of that is in the Brazilian, or will be in the Brazilian government's hands if it comes to that. And I guess we can talk a little bit more about that in the next block.
All right, well, that's fantastic, Brian. Well, we've got a lot to discuss. And I think before we start taking questions from the public, I'm going to cheat a little bit and dive a little more into some of this. Brian, I'm intrigued. You left one of your best parts for last. AOC tweeting on Bolsonaro is putting on my State Department hat. Seems it's a little bit of a little nightmarish in terms of controlling messages and dealing with a delicate relationship. But actually, can we maybe start on this issue? I want to circle back to China very quickly, because I do think that that's going to be, exactly as everyone has described, a central issue of this relationship, and really an axis of this relationship in many ways, as it will be for some time to come. I mean, the Brazil and the United States each have very important relationships with China. Brazil represents obviously a very important actor in China. But I think because of where you left, Brian, I think for all of you, I think it might be good to discuss a little bit about the U.S. context and why that matters. And you mentioned AOC, but really what you're talking about is these very strong positions in many parts of the Democratic Party that want to make climate change a central part of a Biden administration, should it come to that point. welcome any thoughts on how this might be navigated. I understand that in Brazil as well, there's some consideration of some of efforts to modify the approach that the Bolsonaro administration has taken on climate change to deal with it differently. Maybe not to deal with it as a cultural phenomenon, but more as an economic and long-term phenomenon. So how about this issue of friction on environmental issues? Is there room for adaptation on both sides to make the relationship work?
Well, I think there's already been some, right? I mean, the Bolsonaro administration's first reaction when this huge crisis because of the Amazon first exploded in their laps back in August of last year was to be very defensive, was to say that there was no real problem, was to lash out at globalists and the protectionists in Europe, who they said were using the Amazon as a cudgel for their own interests and to kind of make this government that they never really liked in the first place look even worse. And, since then, their posture has changed. Some of the rhetoric has changed. There's tens of thousands of Brazilian troops in the Amazon now with the goal of tamping down some of these fires. This year, though, has been another bad year. Some of that pressure came from agribusiness. I think that it will always be true that the most effective pressure on the Bolsonaro government will come from the inside agribusiness lobby as opposed to the outside, because, frankly, all politics are domestic. And if you dig into the polling, one of the areas where Bolsonaro has the strongest approval rating is in his handling of the Amazon and the environment. This rally around the flag effect that gets produced when people feel like they're being criticized from the exterior, it can end up being counterproductive. But look, the one who said this best is Patricia. As long as this government continues to believe that this is a public relations problem, a communications problem, instead of a reality problem, that's going to be a recipe for conflict. And my concern is that, I think at the beginning of this government, you'll see this assuming again, or I shouldn't assume, we shouldn't assume anything. Let me correct my language there. Should the next government be a Biden administration, there will be, I think, a desire at the beginning to have a cordial relationship. You'll see that amongst the foreign policy crowd. But if it jumps, if the Brazil subject jumps from the foreign policy people to the domestic policy people, and if it becomes a passion topic for the Democratic Party rank and file and the American at large, all bets are off. It could become a really contentious verbal confrontation. And guess what? We got a preview of that last week with the back and forth between Biden and Bolsonaro that may, depending on how our election goes on November 3rd, may prove to have been round one in a, confrontation that could escalate for a while until calmer heads prevail. And if that happens, I don't see any way that the actual policy agenda remains intact. I just don't think it works that way. I don't think that you're going to see things move ahead with the same enthusiasm if you end up with this very antagonistic posture between the two governments.
Ricardo, Patricia, the environmental issue of the Amazon, can you talk a little bit about how that episode played in the general public in Brazil?
Should I start or Ricardo?
Go ahead and start.
Okay. I think one of the things that is very important is private sector reaction. We are seeing a growing movement among agribusiness leadership that realizes that this is going to end up being really bad for business. Bolsonaro government usually, and this is part of the military approach, they say this is foreign agents trying to interfere with Brazilian sovereignty, and there's all this conspiracy thing about the Amazon, and this comes from years and years from the military dictatorship. But the agribusiness sector, and especially the Minister of Agriculture, Teresa Cristina, they have a much more pragmatic understanding of the situation. And they know that, yes, there are some foreign interests. You have the agricultural sector in other countries, such as in European Union, in France, that are protectionist, and they see a way, a vulnerability. If Brazil continues to have this approach to environmental policy and these horrible figures on deforestation and fires, it's an opportunity for them, to put pressure. This is true. They are really happy about this every time. You see the protectionist farmers in France, in Ireland, in all those places. So, and I do think that we have seen, for instance, big agriculture or even meat processing plants like Marfrig and JBS getting together with the World Wildlife Fund, for instance, and to say, we want to distance ourselves from this because this is bad for business. So I think this is something that has started, and I agree with Brian, it has to come from the inside, because as long as you have, people in the outside or the New York Times or, Biden saying, you have to change your environmental policy, it's going to work just like when George W. Bush criticized Chavez. It's actually good for him, So, but if it comes from the economic sector, the private sector, I think this is going to change just because the agribusiness sector is the only sector that is not really in a fragile situation, economic situation at this point in Brazil.
Yeah, I think in addition to the agribusiness sector, I think the financial sector has also been engaging on this topic. The main Brazilian banks and international banks that operate in Brazil have also been putting pressure on this specific thing. But just to say a few words here, I think Bolsonaro has proven to be a very pragmatic politician, as we've been noticing on the way he is building his support bases in Congress and how he has shifted completely from one direction to another on specific issues. It would be, as Patricia highlighted, I think, as long as it is a PR issue, they will be willing to do anything. They will be willing to even replace the Minister of Environment, or maybe merge the Ministry of Environment with the Ministry of Agriculture. I really see these things happening as we move forward. However, I think there will be two problems that will be much harder to deal with. One is also, as Patricia also mentioned, it's the mindset these people have of the Amazon specifically. They believe the Amazon is a region to be developed, and the way they perceive this development somehow related to models that were built in the 1970s. So there's technology, there are different ways that they can develop this. And I honestly believe that the United States could work together on this under a Biden administration, and the Brazilian government will be open to discuss this, the military will be open. But this is very critical in my understanding. I think that they're not talking about the same thing. It's not just a PR problem. It's not something that will go away replacing the ministers. It's not something that will go away just by controlling the fires. It's a different mindset on what needs to be done with the Amazon, which I think, the Europeans have one mindset. They have this understanding, or groups in Europe have that. I'm not sure if that understanding is exactly the same in the United States. And depending on how that plays out, I think there will be more or less room to work on this topics with Brazil.
Ricardo, I think you really hit an important point, which is that we're talking about different things often when you talk about issues, and that cuts across so many things. And I think that's really due to the fact that we're talking about very large countries that can afford to look inward very often and tend to focus on the world from that perspective, because they are worlds unto themselves. And that's certainly the case of the Amazon, where I think the perspective is not one that's understood well. All three of you have made mention of the nationalist component of issues around the Amazon. I think that's not something that is well understood and hasn't been in the United States. I think at the same time, there is perhaps new pressure on it specifically because of what's happened in Venezuela and the really unrestricted abuses of the environment and indigenous lands in the border areas, and really significant damage that's been documented in recent years. Some of it completely unrelated to events inside of Brazil, but that certainly impact conditions inside Brazil. Can we talk a little bit about Venezuela as well? I think it was framed, Patricia, you made it. I think you made a very good point, which is that there may be some sort of shift if there is a Biden administration, but it will not be a dramatic shift in favor of a different or a new and positive relationship with the Maduro regime in Caracas. Obviously, one big area for Brazil remains the issue of refugees and the flow of refugees south, but there's also the regional political aspect. Patricia, how do you think this issue of Venezuela is being seen by the Bolsonaro administration? Clearly, it's being dealt with both as a matter of the relationship with the United States, but as a pragmatic issue for Brazil as well. What do you think the view is there on the issues of Venezuela?
Just remembering that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the really tough sanctions against Venezuela started in the Obama administration, right? I was remembering this. So this is something that would not change, but I think it would be less, I mean, we all remember that President Trump always says, the famous sentence, all options are on the table. And this is very obvious. It's almost childish, the way that you always say that. I think this would change. And in terms of the Brazilian government, Itamaraty's position is that the previous administrations, and they are right in a way, they always said, it's important to maintain the communication channels open because this is the only way we can influence the government, to grow less authoritarian. And the fact is that it never changed and it never really helped to have those communication channels open. Although the way it is now, it's the complete opposite. I mean, we don't even have diplomatic representation there. We have no, in the beginning, for instance, Vice President Mourão, he served in Venezuela. So he has important contacts with the Venezuelan military authorities, officials. So these channels, and Mourão is the one who recognizes this, would have been important to maintain. You need to have some sort of communication with them. At this point, what I think is that Brazil has never had such a small possibility of, or such a small influence in what happens in Venezuela. We're not even participating in multilateral talks. The only thing we are doing is welcoming refugees, and this is something that I'm really proud of this government and previous governments, that we are doing a good job in welcoming these refugees. And Venezuela, I've been to Roraima many times, and I know they're doing a good job, even the military in the border. But in terms of trying to influence somehow a transition process in Venezuela, I think Brazil just bet everything that the new Juan Guaidó would be acclaimed the new president. That has not happened. They don't have communication whatsoever with the current government, Maduro government. And now we're just, supporting actors in the whole negotiation scenario.
So on this issue, actually, now that still on the issue of regional cooperation, I would note that we are 45 minutes into this, and I don't believe we've said the word COVID once. I believe that's a record for any presentation I've been involved in over the last 6 months. But now we're going to change that, because I think that this is going to be the issue of Venezuela. It raises the question of flows of people, flows of disease in the case of COVID, but also the importance of cooperation and regional cooperation. Does this remain an area of important bilateral cooperation going forward, regardless of who is in the White House? Brian or Ricardo, thoughts on the issue of COVID and how might that change conditions. Ricardo, I also want to circle back in a moment to ask about what you mentioned about the challenging fiscal situation that's going to be emerging in Brazil. But first on COVID, any thoughts actually from any of you on this issue?
Okay, I can say a few words about this. I think the COVID situation, let's say, that made things worse at a time when we already had a challenging landscape across Latin America. And I'm not saying challenging just economically or in the security perspective, but I think the space, the possibilities for cooperation with other countries are just harder than they were previously because of a governmental shift in Argentina, just the whole economic crisis and how COVID is affecting the countries, how the countries had to close their borders and restrict flights. And so there was just absolutely no movement of people between the countries for several months. And some countries still have restrictions on movement of people. So the position, to say a few words specifically related to public health, I think the approach that the Brazilian Ministry of Health decided to have on this topic from the very beginning, which was not to play an active role in the policies and let states and governors play this role. It was actually a Supreme Court decision that delegated this to governors and to municipal governments. However, the Ministry of Health took that very seriously, and they never really said much on what kinds of things should be needed to address this. So it's just interesting the way this whole thing play out. I think specifically at the beginning, Brazil was kind of an outlier in the region because it had no policies in place or no national policies in place of quarantining or anything like that. And all other countries did. Peru, Chile, Argentina had a very, very strict rules on that. And the countries were talking, and there were meetings of high-level meetings among the ministries of health of these countries. And Brazil was just, when they did attend these meetings, it wasn't the first tier of the ministry who was representing them in the meetings. Several months on, I think everyone seems to be doing a pretty bad job, and the fact that they're not cooperating remains there. So I think it's the only kind of thing that we took from all of this, is just to make cooperation a lot harder. After this whole thing is gone, and perhaps a transition in the administration in the US will kind of trigger this. But right now, I think this possibility for regional cooperation is quite limited in South America and Latin America as a whole.
It's tragic. I mean, I think that it's really unfortunate that the Americas seem to be the most impacted region in the world at this point, and it will have lasting repercussions. And it does come back to this other point. We're all going to need to trade. We're all going to need commerce. That raises the issue of China, and that raises the issue of how important China's role has grown in recent years. It has been in the United States for a long time as a trade partner, but certainly in the rest of the Americas, it clearly is an emerging force. It's already quite powerful in many ways. This is in many ways a second wave of Chinese and commercial involvement in the region that has been avowedly aggressive in pursuing these kinds of commercial relationships, and sometimes in very clear competition with the United States. In telecommunications, that's certainly one sector that the 5G race is one where that leaps to the fore. But this is such an important issue. I want to ask all three of you, And Brian, let me start with you. How do you see the issue of China evolving in the bilateral relationship between the United States and Brazil?
You know, it's funny, Ricardo, all of these subjects that you're mentioning, whether it's Amazon or Venezuela or China, they all remind me of the same thing, which is how diffuse power is in Brazil. And, you know, it's funny because we have this image, especially with a leader like Bolsonaro, who cultivates this macho kind of strongman image. And you think that he's, you know, people from the outside maybe think that he's so powerful, but actually on all three of these issues, there's all these different groups competing for his ear, competing to sort of nudge him in different directions. And what you see unfold over the course of, you know, nearly 2 years of government now has been him sort of tacking a little bit in each direction based on kind of who is in his ear. And China is no different. China is one where there's all kinds of competing interests. Here again, you see the influence of agribusiness. China is not only Brazil's biggest trading partner, but if I'm not mistaken, the commercial balance is actually 3 times bigger than the United States. It's, you know, it's a huge commercial partner. And so, you know, you have a government, the Brazilian government, that my sort of read on it is they really don't want Huawei involved in 5G. This is kind of a threshold for a lot of the conservatives who are now sort of running the show at Itamaraty, at the foreign ministry, starting with Minister Araújo himself. But on the other hand, you have an establishment that's absolutely terrified that this 5G question will unfold in a way that will alienate China. And just today, if I'm not mistaken, China, and I actually didn't, I'm not sure if it was the embassy there or if it came out of Beijing, but they said, you know, the future of this relationship, Brazil, will be defined based on how you guys determine the Huawei and the 5G question. So, you know, it's a lot of pressure. Trying to figure out which way they'll go. It depends a lot on, I think, who gets elected here. And, you know, how much it turns into, you know, how much or to what extent are we headed back to a Cold War style world where you're obligated, at least at some level, to take sides between, you know, the black pieces on the chessboard and the white pieces on the chessboard.
Brian, is that even possible anymore in a world where the connections run so deep? Because the one challenge, I think, with the Cold War analogy is you're talking about this is much more of a 19th century struggle than a 20th century one. It's commercial powers as much as strategic powers are in competition, and Brazil is a perfect example of a place where that comes into very clear tension, and it's hard to.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that even during the Cold War, you had countries that were very pro-U.S. that were still selling wheat to the Soviet Union.
That's true.
And, you know, there's a difference. One interesting distinction that I've heard people in Brazil make is, you know, okay, we can be China's, or rather, China is our customer, but not necessarily our ally. Whether that's viable or not, to go to the question that you just asked, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody knows the answer to that. I do know, you know, sort of the most accurate sounding representation of the path forward, kind of where I think this is going to go, came from, let's say, a long-standing, very experienced politician in Brazil, who, when I was talking with him about this question, he said, you know, I think we have to ultimately do what Getulio Vargas did during World War II. And I was instantly pretty shocked when he said that. I said, what, you mean like stay neutral until, you know, he says, well, look, Getulio stayed out of that debate, that polarization, if you will, for as long as was possible, and was then able to enter, ultimately on behalf of the Allies, in a way that was the most advantageous to Brazil possible. You know, Brazil's steel, and the seeds for Brazil's steel industry were planted as a result of, you know, having helped the Allies in World War II. And this person said, you know, he said, our biggest geopolitical advantage is that Brazil is far. And, you know, we will probably not be the first people who have to make a decision about which side we're going to take if it ultimately goes in that direction. I don't know if that's right, but I thought it was interesting. And it reflects kind of this conflicted feeling that I think a lot of people have in Brazil about how to manage this question.
Patricia, do you think that's right? Is there room to hold off on and wait to see how this relationship evolves?
Well, they have already postponed, right? I mean, the auction was supposed to take place this year, but I don't think they're going to be able to postpone it much longer. I mean, we're going to be really behind in terms of technology. We could be doing something like what India is doing. India has not said in so many words, the Indian government, we're going to ban Huawei, but in effect, that's what they're doing. Although, I mean, Brazil, what I think in Brazil, I mean, as Brian was saying, we have a division. You have the ideological wing, so to say, that is completely against any kind of strategic deal with China, and they have the same view of China. However, it's hard because you have, on the other hand, you have the agricultural sector and also all the phone companies, the phone operators. For instance, the approach that the US has been having with Brazil in terms of Huawei and China, it's only sticks and not sticks and carrots, because they only say, if you let Huawei in your 5G infrastructure, you're going to have consequences. This is actually something that was said by the ambassador. Or I've interviewed State Department officials who said, you know, we're going to have to cut intelligence sharing. And I mean, it is all reasonable because there is, you know, no trust in infrastructure because they need to share information with the Chinese government. However, at the same time, you have China, and I also did a story on that, in the northeastern states. They're just going there with all this subsidized China development loans and offering all kinds of things, as while the US is just saying you cannot do this and putting pressure and saying, you know, you should fear China because there's no security, it's a threat to your national security. But they could be more active in doing, for instance, the International Development Finance Corporation, that it's been said that it's going to play a role in foreign policy, you know. So for instance, using funding from the International Finance Development Corporation to fund, and I've heard that's going to be possible, not an American company, but, you know, Ericsson or a Nokia for infrastructure, for 5G infrastructure in Brazil. I heard that it's going to be, you know, they could finance other companies from other countries if that's in the national security interest. Or with Mauricio Claver Caroni leading the Inter-American Development Bank also, and I know one of his priorities is the nearshoring and, you know, bringing back the supply chains back home. This could be also a target if, you know, it's in the strategic interest of the US. I think these would be ways of also giving incentives and not only pressure and not only threatening to cut intelligence sharing. I think this could be something.
Ricardo, could I ask you, is there, this was another question, the fundamental question was, does Brazil really have a choice with respect to the relationship with China? Not only is it, as Brian pointed out, a massive trading partner, but it's a huge presence in terms of supply chains, in terms of many other aspects of the economy. But there must also be some level of concern among some sectors in the Brazilian private sector about exactly that level of immersion as an investor into other areas of the Brazilian infrastructure on the part of Chinese companies. But how is that relationship with China seen by the private sector at least in Sao Paulo or around Brazil?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think overall, Brazil, in different strategic areas of Brazil has always sought to diversify its partners. If you look at Brazil's trade partners, China's the main importer of Brazilian products right now, but not by far. If you add up the European countries, you see the European countries are up there. If you add up the developing countries, you'll see that the developing countries are up there as well. If you add up the United States, you'll see that the United States is up there as well. So this has always been something that Brazil sought to have, not to be too dependent on any country. The worst nightmare for Brazilian policymakers in different areas is to have a similar situation to what Mexico has, which is a total reliance on the United States for the economy, for technology, for other areas. And this also includes the military. I think it's important what Patricia said, because the military also have this mindset. They're not necessarily comfortable with Chinese technology being used in the country, but they're not necessarily comfortable with too much dependence on foreign technology. They would rather develop something using existing technology, something that was locally developed. So that being said, I think the private sector in Brazil, mostly, they're very pragmatic. They're very, very pragmatic. They don't really favor China over the United States. They see China as an important source of financing. They see China as an important destiny for exports. You will hear from some industrial segments that are competing with Chinese imports, that the competition is not fair. But overall, I don't think this vision prevails. I really think what prevails is something that Brazil should be more independent, not to be reliant on any specific countries, and the Chinese are there willing to do business. So let's be very pragmatic and do business with them. And Paulo Guedes he hasn't really been talking about China recently, but in the occasions where the relationship with China got a little bit awkward because of the conservative groups, the economist groups also stepped in, and these guys really represent the financial sector in Brazil and as a significant part of the São Paulo private sector, if we can put it this way. So we have the agriculture sector, who really favors this relationship with China. We have the business sector, who are pragmatic. They don't make any judgments on whether China is better or worse for Brazil. And even in the military, which is a critical pillar of this government, you see them being pragmatic as well. They can absolutely work with China. Mourão was the one who went to China at the beginning. He was the one who first took the trip to China to improve the relations between Bolsonaro and the Chinese government. So I see Brazil open for business, essentially, for the Chinese. I don't see any kind of strong pressure coming from inside against the Chinese.
Something that the United States often said with respect to this relationship going back years has been pointed out that there's a difference also in the types of relationship. The United States was the biggest market for Brazil in terms of manufactured goods. So the United States represented a better chance to move up the value chain than China did. And that certainly was a case that we've been able to make for many, many years. In recent years, I think too, this issue of unbalanced competition, unfair competition experienced by Brazilian producers has potentially been another point of friction. It seems like there is these are all issues that are not unique to the United States, not unique to Brazil. China represents its own phenomenon in terms of really the world and how the world deals with this challenge. So I think this is going to be something. Brian, go ahead.
I just wanted to add on that because it dovetails with the point that you're making. I got a little bit insecure about having made that statement about exports to China being 3 times what they were to the U.S. and decided to fact check myself in real time and I'm an old reporter and nerd, and so I know exactly where to find these things. And I was right. Exports to China in the first 9 months of this year were $53 billion compared to $15 billion to the United States. And get this, soy alone, the exports that Brazil sends to China were bigger than all exports to the United States during that time. So that again shows you, Ricardo uses the word pragmatic, and I think it's fair, but I think it's also fair to say that that money talks, that when you have an economy that's shrinking and under extreme duress, like Brazil's is, there's even more hesitance to sort of make decisions that might damage you. Even when, you can call that ideology, some would refer to it as, money isn't everything. You have to make decisions about security and strategy and long-term allies rather than short-term money. But man, it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. It leaves unresolved that issue of what kind of an economy it's going to be. And clearly, agriculture is the engine for growth right now in Brazil. But it comes back to that issue that Ricardo mentioned about diversification. There's also that concern, not only reliance on a single market, but on a single industry or a single sector to really drive that growth. Diversification has been a part of the model that's been pursued by across generations now in Brazil, and remains challenging because of the international system. Brian, your point actually really reminds me of just how complex this period could be, because regardless of who is elected in the United States, you could have a situation where the trade war with China is resolved and U.S. agricultural exports resume in significant quantities, so that soy figure that you mentioned becomes significantly reduced, due to circumstance and I think at some point all of our countries are going to have to deal with the fact that we are facing a very challenging hangover once the economies are moving again in a maybe not post-COVID environment, but in a COVID-controlled environment. So in that context, are there aspects of the commercial relationship that are clearly ripe for development? Patricia, you mentioned the use of the IDFC, perhaps to finance in the case of 5G, but are there other areas that you see as ripe for further development? That's what I thought. See, this is the problem. We've all looked at this problem a long time. Please go ahead.
Whatever the solution or the possibilities are, it will necessarily involve cash, as Brian said. I think Brazil, as I mentioned, will be in a difficult position. It's already in a very difficult financial position, and they're looking at ways and means to finance the different areas in the government, infrastructure, Amazon, all this needs to be financed, and they will be looking for cooperation for this. So if there are channels, financing mechanisms and things like that, this is the key for a successful strengthening of any relationship with Brazil.
Brian?
Well, your question comes back to the, sort of the insecurity that longtime U.S.-Brazil people have had for years, which is that at the end of the day, it's possible that these are two large, somewhat closed economies that just don't complement each other very well. And, when it comes down to, okay, so there's talk potentially of a trade deal in a second Trump administration, if that was to come to fruition. And I'm not an expert on these things. And so there may be somebody who can sit here and break down sector by sector a very convincing case of what exactly that would look like. But I haven't really heard it yet. And what I do know, I've talked a lot over the years I've been covering sort of the US-Brazil relationship in one way or another for 10 to 15 years now. And I've heard people express that, let's call it insecurity behind closed doors a lot. And it's one of the reasons why, when you have a moment like this with two governments that get along very well, you see people kind of sitting across the table from each other saying, okay, what are we going to do? And there's answers, there's things that can be done, but people are always left feeling like there's something else out there. Like, what's the big thing? And in the current context, at least, the way the world economy is set up and geopolitical alliances and so on, there's never been a hugely convincing answer to that. Maybe, again, if we're headed to a more bipolar world, a more Cold War style world, maybe that changes the equation. Brazil becomes a much more obvious answer to that. And maybe the commercial relationship then follows suit, meaning that there may be more of a reason to make sacrifices on the US side and pull Brazil in, because basically for geostrategic reasons. We'll see.
Right. I mean, there's this argument that decoupling could eventually become a real thing for a series of reasons, not only because of COVID, but because it makes strategic sense, in which case you could potentially see a country with massive industrial capacity like Brazil, in a case where you had trade facilitation, be able to become a larger producer. It's also true in the case of Mexico, where that's been, in fact, the model. Essentially, Mexico for many years did very well for industries moving back from Asia to North America because of the U.S. market. It's possible that you could have other parts of the world, including Brazil, involved in that. And Brian, I mean, I think just to borrow my own platform here for a minute, there is a lot of room for trade facilitation and for increased flow in both directions in terms of services, in terms of goods. These are often trapped in Custo Brasil is always the refrain that's used. But in fact, Brian, I think you framed it correctly. These are both difficult markets. If you're from the US perspective, Brazil is a very challenging place to do business, as Brazilian business people will tell you many times, because of the regulatory and tax structure, which can be very burdensome, but it's clearly worth it because of the market in certain aspects. And the same in the United States, very clearly. There is a real incentive. And we did see that. We saw that in tourism. We saw that in medical devices and in medical services, the flow in both directions, on franchising. So there are those areas, but you're right, Brian, that the relationship has been around $100 billion a year for a while, the two-way trade. And so one of the questions is, how can how can we expand beyond that? Could I switch gears here for a minute? This is a topic that is maybe implicit in everything we've been talking about, but on these issues that Patricia mentioned about cultural issues, human rights issues, cultural differences, are those points of friction that are simply going to be episodic and arise sporadically, or are there sort of fundamental concerns that arise from just these very different worldviews? Patricia, maybe could we start with you on this one?
Yes, I just wanted to go a little bit back to when you're talking about it is a good opportunity to Brazil to, it would be for us to have a better relationship with China. Of course, we want to sell value-added products, and it's not a good, healthy relationship. But at this point, if we think that the primary deficit is going to be around like $850 billion reais this year, and debt to GDP ratio, it's like 90%. It's not like we're going to be able to be picky or something, So maybe the timing is, and the trade facilitation thing, that it's likely that we're gonna have a trade facilitation agreement. And even though it's not glamorous, it's really, really useful and important for the businessman. But I don't think this is the point where Brazil is gonna have the power to confront China on, terms of trade or, that kind of thing. But going back to the cultural issues. So I think that if there is a Biden administration, he's going to have to, he's going to be held accountable by his constituency. And they would not tolerate if you have an American president just being all like really good friends with the Brazilian president that has been adopting measures that are seen as anti-LGBT community or anti-indigenous communities or misogynistic. So it's not only cultural. I think this is something that the base and mainly the left wing of the Democratic Party is going to be really hard on that. And we would see an accommodation, between moderates like Biden and the, AOC wing of the party, and it would be not sustainable, or they would not allow him to have a close relationship with President Bolsonaro if the Brazilian administration is seen as, taking measures that are really bad for those minority groups, I think.
How about, yeah, and actually, Patricia, can I ask you, just digging in a little bit more, what about on the other side? If Bolsonaro's brand is very much of someone who is a defender of the values that you described in this Christian alliance, this religious alliance, an accommodation with a more liberal or left-leaning Biden administration, how would that work for him?
That's interesting. I think that for this agenda to change, it would have to change Itamaraty, because that's the agenda, the whole, alliance for religious freedom and cultural issues and women's health. So if Brazil, I don't think Brazil would change that. I don't think this is the line, this is the spirit of the diplomacy right now. So unless you change, the whole Olavista wing, Itamaraty, this would not change. I don't think it would change. They might accommodate in other topics, but not in this one.
So along the same lines, if he didn't have to change, if there was a President Trump were reelected, how would that impact the Bolsonaro's position domestically in Brazil, if at all? Ricardo, Brian?
Is for me, this question?
For Ricardo or Brian. Patricia, also you, if you're interested. Okay. Ricardo, why don't you start?
I think, it wouldn't affect much, Ricardo, to be honest with you. Bolsonaro's approval rates are high, or very high right now, as probably mentioned here. It's just as high as it was when he was when he first inaugurated, when this government was inaugurated. And I think the reason for it remaining high is partially related to the economic programs in place, to these cash transfer programs. People overestimate that a little too. I think there is a lot of the traditional, a lot of the Centrão theme at an election year, and just this whole thing. If you travel to the Northeast, a friend of mine was just in the interior of Alagoas recently, and he sent some pictures of outdoor posters of candidates for mayors. They're all standing near Bolsonaro. He really learned how politics works in Brazil, and the way for him to remain a popular politician. So I really don't think these foreign issues, these foreign affairs issues really matter to the vast majority of the people here. This really has no impact, except for very small groups in the cities. They're more disturbed by the way he deals with some topics. But overall, I think I really don't think this will have an impact for Bolsonaro domestically.
Brian, Patricia, do you agree?
If the question, the questions about the potential impact of things like human rights abuses and other on the international relationship, and I agree broadly. I don't see, under a Trump administration, the second Trump administration, I don't see much pressure on that front. Under a Biden administration, look, I could be wrong, but I think that the only issue that's likely to really rise up and contaminate the relationship is the Amazon. That could change if there's, we all know that these issues are real. We all know the increase in police killings in places like Rio. We all know the the persecution that many minority governments feel. It's not that the problem, I mean, the problem is real, but I don't see it really affecting the bilateral relationship that much.
Patricia, do you agree?
Yes, I think maybe it would not be big enough for a Biden administration to, as we say in Portuguese, comprar uma briga, like to be willing to confront Bolsonaro's government on that. I think the Amazon, yes, this is like a unifying theme, but in other terms like human rights, unless there is some judicial changes, something really, really important that you have an international lobby against such kinds of measures. But other than that, I think I agree with Brian. I don't think you would see a Biden administration confronting Bolsonaro on other things.
Well, very good. Look, we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to open the floor here for any sort of final thoughts that you might have, or any words of advice for either incoming U.S. administration or for the Brazilian government about understanding what's important in the relationship. Brian, I'm gonna start with you.
Well, I don't know about advice. I mean, I think I've seen lots of people try to tell the Bolsonaro government and its various representatives over the last year and a half plus, your relationship really needs to be with the United States government and not with one particular president. That message fell on deaf ears for a very long time. And it now, I think, really because of the polls, I think that the sort of the footing in Brasilia has begun to change as a result. But not enough. if we're headed to a Biden administration, I think that the reaction that Bolsonaro posted to Biden's words the night before on his Facebook page and on his other social media accounts, he had to reply. But to use words like cowardly, he didn't do himself any favors. Unless you believe, and this is possible, I mean, maybe you could argue that in some sort of tactical negotiation, you want to slam the table to start and then sort of back off and make friends. Diplomacy is changing. Maybe there was a degree of wisdom to that. But I can tell you definitively that there were corners of the governmental world in Brazil, people in Brasilia who support Bolsonaro, who were very uncomfortable with the president's response, who wish that he hadn't done that. And so I think the challenge is going to be twofold. It's going to be, trying to lower the temperature in those kinds of confrontations that are probably going to be inevitable. And then also, again, try to keep Brazil from being a passion topic for others within the Democratic Party. I mentioned AOC, but it's not just her. If it makes its way onto her Twitter account and others, if Bolsonaro becomes a really big deal, bigger than he is now, all of these potential avenues for progress that we've been discussing for the last hour and a half, I think become in a certain amount of peril.
Thanks, Brian. Patricia.
I think I always keep on thinking that, thank God, we have diplomats and other public servants who are not linked to any parties or presidents, and they've seen so many different presidents on both sides come and go, and they sometimes, and I think lately, they've been managing to put some technical aspects, some pragmatism, and I think that's the only reason we have not had a more serious rupture up until now, because we know President Bolsonaro is speaking to a domestic audience mainly. He has to be really confrontatious, and then you have the diplomats and other public servants trying to keep the channels open, maintain normality, and show that the relationship is between governments, not between presidents. So it all depends on how much pressure does President Bolsonaro suffer from the more ideological wings of his government, to act as he's not being bullied or he's defending the sovereignty of the Amazon or something, because then it might escalate. And as Brian said, Twitter, Facebook, social media, you're going to see something getting out of control because they need to save face, and they're going to be escalating something that ends up not being well. I guess that's what I think.
Thank you, Patricia. Ricardo, final words?
Yeah, just wanted to say that, well, the United States leverage, if we can put it this way, in Brazil is very limited when we compare to the leverage that the US has in other countries in the region. There's no FTA in place. I mean, the actual strategic relationship is just not there for the US to do anything, regardless of who wins the election. So for the US to preserve its interests in Brazil, and when I say preserve interests, is be the Chinese growing presence in Latin America, be the Amazon issue under a Biden administration, they will really need to build cooperation channels, and these cooperation channels will involve financing mechanisms. I don't see this relationship going anywhere without first the strengthening and then creating the leverage for that to be in place. As it is right now, I just think Brazil will consider the Chinese, they will consider other countries. There's no, just not enough leverage in the country as a whole, even though the presidents are close to move anything here. So
I think that's a really important observation, Ricardo, and I think this issue of financing mechanisms is a very important one. It's certainly central to the creation of the International Development Finance Corporation in the United States. This observation that this is a competition of means as much as it is about, it's certainly not about ideology. It's about capacity and what can you do to help governments deliver the public good. That's really what this is about in so many cases, and certainly in the case of Brazil and the United States. And it's a vital relationship. I thank the three of you for participating in this, and I certainly learned a lot. Brian, you shocked me with your 3 times the volume of trade and on soy alone. But I learned something from each of you. And again, as always, this is obviously an issue that's going to demand some follow-up after our elections in November, and there will be other topics that are certainly going to rise. But I think you've done a fantastic job, each of you, in elevating the topics that are going to be in conversations between the leaders of both countries in the coming months and years. As always, I appreciate your enthusiasm and research and really the new ideas that you brought. So a very big thanks to all of you and to the team at the Wilson Center for putting this together. Appreciate it and look forward to having you with us again. Thank you to everyone who tuned in and who turned in some questions and who was just here to be a part of this very important discussion. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.